Welcome to another episode of the Impact Disciple Making Podcast. I'm Mike Keaton, your host, and I am glad that you're here today. And I also have the privilege of sitting with Ken Adams, the lead pastor of Crossroads Church and founder of Impact Ministries. And we continue our discussions on disciple making, specifically talking about the marks of a disciple, Ken. We've covered several of these marks, and so today we're going to talk about one that I know is dear to your heart, and that is the mark that a disciple is a multiplier.
Right.
So Ken, there's a lot of thoughts out there where people say and think that you really aren't a full-blown disciple until you've actually made another disciple.
Right.
So what do you think about that?
Well, let's remember one very important thing, and that is that when Jesus started his mission, when Jesus came to start his mission, I can assure you that he never had a movement of addition in mind. I mean, from the very beginning, Jesus envisioned his mission being accomplished by a movement of multiplying disciples, not just adding disciples. You see, the thing is, Mike, if all we're doing is adding disciples, we're never gonna make it happen. You can't even keep up with the growth of the population if all we're doing is adding disciples. So I would agree that Jesus started a mission that would become a movement of multiplication. But to answer your question, can you be a disciple and not be multiplying? I would say it like this: you're not a fully trained disciple unless you're a multiplying disciple. So in essence, getting to the point where you're multiplying other disciples would be really one of the final marks, or one of the most complete marks, fully trained marks of a disciple. So you can be a disciple and be a member and be a minister and magnifier and all these other, characteristics. But ultimately, the goal of being a disciple is to make disciples. I mean, it's clearly what Jesus had in mind and what he intended, And so Jesus didn't take the 12, spend 3 years with them in order for them to just forget the mission. Jesus clearly wanted them to share that process, make disciples, and then those disciples go make more disciples, and that eventually would multiply. It would happen exponentially, and literally the mission of seeing all nations become disciples could be fulfilled.
Yeah, and that would be incredible. And so when you think about that kind of being that, not necessarily the final mark, but a place where you want to get to, then how? I mean, it begs the question: how do you become a multiplier?
Well, so if we go back and look at what Jesus did, and we let Jesus be our model, which is always a place to start, is that you read through the Gospels and you see that Jesus had really a couple of very simple steps that he used in that process. First step was selection, and so Jesus chose a group of individuals that were willing, that were faithful, that were available, that were teachable. He looked for people that didn't necessarily have the right number of degrees on the wall, or the right education, or the right last name. He looked for people who had the right heart. He looked for people who were truly qualified to be willing to fulfill the mission he was calling. They were willing to become fishers of men. They were willing to become followers and would live out the mission that he was going to call them to. So very first thing Jesus did was he selected the right individuals. So it's very important that when we get ready to make disciples and multiply disciples, that we look for people who are willing. We look for people who have the right heart and that are willing to pay the cost, if you will, to make disciples. And so that's step number one. I think step number two is that Jesus not only selected the right individuals, but he trained those individuals. And so, disciples aren't made overnight. Right. It takes time. And so Jesus had a lot more time than we do, and he invested in a small handful of people over a period of, right around 3 years. He spent, close to 24/7 with those guys, and maybe not always 24/7, but a lot of the time that he spent with them. And that the purpose of that was that they would be prepared to accomplish the mission. Jesus didn't give his disciples everything they could know, but he did give them everything they needed to know.
That's good.
So we spend so much of our time just trying to get deeper. There's nothing wrong with going deeper.
Sure.
But if we keep going deeper and we never get wider, we're not accomplishing the mission.
That's right.
And so we want to keep learning, keep growing, keep getting deeper, while we are making disciples that make disciples. So I would say that if we're gonna become multipliers, we've got to select the right people. We've got to teach and train the right way, and then the next step is that we've got to delegate, and we've got to. So I would say selection, impartation, and then delegation.
Okay.
And so what I mean by that is that Jesus literally tested them before he turned them loose. So Jesus knew that they were ready to carry out the mission before he commissioned them and actually sent them out to fulfill the Great Commission. So what Jesus did is that Jesus strategically put them in positions where they could demonstrate their commitment and their competency to making more disciples. So there were several times, Mike, that Jesus would send out the disciples in pairs, and then he would send them out in larger groups, and then he would send out even the 70, and he would bring them back, and they would talk about what they experienced and what they learned. So Jesus was not just hoping that a movement would break out. Jesus was intentionally training and mobilizing and delegating people so that he knew before he left here that this movement was going to continue. And we are sitting here 2,000 years later, evidence of the fact that they did multiply disciples, because we're proof of that. So Jesus would have selected the right individuals. He would have trained the right way. He would have delegated and demonstrated that they could carry that out. And then the last thing that he did is he commissioned them. And so he gave them a charge to go out and to make more disciples. And so, the Bible tells us that Jesus called his disciples to a mountainside in Galilee. And we don't know exactly where that is, but there is a peak in the northwest side of the Sea of Galilee called Mount Arbel. And it's really the highest peak there. It's a little bit of a plateau. And I could just picture that being the place where Jesus took his disciples and said to them, I want you to go. I give you all authority to go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I've commanded you. And so Jesus was very, very clear about what he was calling us to do, what he was telling us to do as disciples, is to go and make more disciples. And so it's very clear that they were obedient to that. And the next generation, our next generation, depends on our obedience to that command.
Yeah, that's pretty powerful right there. To your third point, I always think about, Jesus just did not sit around and do Bible studies.
Yeah.
Not that that's something wrong with that, but he was very, like you said, he was very intentional and wasn't just hoping that a movement would start.
Yeah.
So that's really good.
Yep.
So it seems simple in a lot of ways. I don't think it's easy, but it is simple in concept. But why do you think, Ken, that it's so hard to see that multiplication or that multiplying doesn't take place?
Mike, you are so right. It honestly, it really is hard. And I think, I think of all the people that I've invested time in, that I've spent years with, and they'll come to the group, they'll fill out the blanks, they'll fill out the book, set it on the shelf, and never go out and make another disciple. And it's frustrating, but I think I know why it's so hard. Because the one thing that the enemy is going to attack more than anything else that we do in Christianity is multiplication. Because that is where the power is.
Yes.
If you don't believe it, look at Islam. Because if we would ever get serious about the Great Commission and making disciples that make disciples, then the enemy would be shaking in his boots. So the enemy's not going to worry. The enemy isn't frightened at all about a movement of addition. You know, it says in Exodus chapter 1 that when a new Pharaoh had come to rule, didn't know who Joseph was, it says that he was afraid that the Israelites would multiply and overthrow the Egyptians. So, Mike, I really believe the greatest threat to the spiritual enemy in our world today is that a movement of multiplying disciples would break out somewhere. And he will pull all hell out to try and stop that from happening. I think he will even concede movements of addition to keep us from ever really experiencing movement of multiplication. I think we can pull off incredible teaching events, incredible evangelistic events, mission trips, worship events. I think we can pull off lots of things. But the enemy will fight tooth and nail to keep a movement from multiplication from ever really happening. I believe it with all my heart.
And Impact Ministries is really trying to make a difference there.
And we are. We really are. And I can tell you that the whole reason that Impact Ministries exists is because we believe that Jesus started the church the way he wants it, the way he wanted it. Now he wants it the way he started it. And he wants the church. He wants the church to be a movement of multiplication. That's what he died for. He came and gave his life so that the church would be a movement of multiplying disciples because he cares about the world. And he knew that the only way that the world could be reached is with a whole movement of people on mission for Christ. And so at Impact Ministries, we're trying to do really is 4 things. We're trying to expose people to the ideas of disciple making. We're trying to educate people in the principles of disciple making. We're trying to establish movements of disciple making in local churches. And then we're trying to engage people who want to be a part of seeing that happen. And so we're asking people to pray and to give and to support and to even come and partner and serve through Impact Ministries. And so you can find out a lot about that at our website, man, impactdisciples.com. And we've got some resources. One I would like to just kind of show you real quick is called Finding Your Place in a Movement of, in a multiplying movement. And so we've got lots of resources like this, Mike, that a person can find on our website. And they're just resources to help facilitate launching movements of multiplication in churches and in businesses, schools, wherever you're willing to go. God can use you to start a movement of multiplying disciples.
Absolutely. And that's really close to your heart, and it certainly is evident, and God is blessing that effort. And so thank you, Ken, for your heart and your passion for the mission of the church. And we also thank you for your heart and your passion for the mission of disciple making, and for tuning in today to this episode. And hopefully it's been helpful for you and maybe inspiring for you to seek out and to pursue with your life and your efforts of seeing a movement of multiplication take place and becoming a multiplier, but also helping others become a multiplier. So don't forget, you can find more content just like this, as well as this resource and many others at impactdisciples.com. And thanks again for tuning in today. We'll see you next time.